Avalokitesvara clearly saw that all five aggregates are empty and thus relieved all suffering. That's the good news. So, I was thinking last week about what I would like to talk about in the summer, and had a lot of different ideas. But mostly I was a little bit tired. And I was thinking, summertime, it's so abundant, but also can't be too complicated. It's more like swimming in a clear river, or maybe a barbecue, playing frisbee. That's the summer. So what is the summer dharma? And I was right on the edge of wanting to teach about the Lotus Sutra, and it didn't feel like the right time. I know some of you are hungry for that. Some of you don't know what I'm talking about, but if you're hungry for the Lotus Sutra, that will be around the season of hunger, which is the fall. Abundance and hunger. But for the summer, I'm going to talk a series here about the paramitas, sometimes called the perfections or the crossing overs, a really core teaching of the Mahayana, the very earliest Mahayana texts that we have, which really were written down at a very similar time to the Pali Canon texts, which people usually regard as the oldest texts, but actually, in terms of the record, we don't really know, actually. They're all kind of, from a scholarly perspective, kind of happening at the same time, these early Mahayana teachings. And right from those very earliest Mahayana teachings we have are these teachings about these crossing overs, these paramitas. Like I said, sometimes gets translated as perfection. It's a little bit hard for people coming from a Puritan background to relate with the word perfection. And so we use that word a lot, but always feeling like I need to remind people that it's not that kind of circumscribed perfection, like we know what it looks like, cram yourself in that box. But it's really more of the path of awakening, which is a kind of crossing over. It's a transformation of suffering. It's a transformation of the kind of limited way that we consider or regard the potential and the beauty of our lives. We tend to really underestimate what it is that we've received. And this crossing over is about waking up to something, about the profundity of what our life is. And that's where this relief comes from. So the clear seeing that this first part of the Heart Sutra, which we chant every Sunday, actually at the temple we chant every day. Sometimes we chant in the Sino-Japanese, you'll be familiar with that. It goes kanji, zaibo, sa, gyojin, hanya, hara, mitaji, up sometimes with the drum. We do really energetically. And then on Sundays we chant in English. This is really core teaching of wisdom, and so we're chanting it all the time. And the clear seeing that it refers to is the basis of this crossing over, or a transformation, or a change in regard for what's the significance of our life or how we're living. And the clear seeing in Buddhism is called wisdom, or prajna. So the prajna paramita texts, you hear me talking about that. Those are the perfection of wisdom texts. That's the way it's usually translated. Prajna paramita. The Heart Sutra that we chant is maybe the most famous of those texts. The heart of the Prajna paramita text. Would someone just close that door? The wind's going to smack it and might break the window. Thank you. So this Prajna paramita teaching, where the 6 perfections are found in their earliest form, is really concerned with wisdom. It's concerned with clear seeing. It's concerned with how it is that the world appears to us. This is really important. Oftentimes we just think in terms of what am I experiencing, but we forget to think about how am I experiencing? What is my regard for things? What is the way in which I'm approaching things, which deeply determines the way in which the world will appear to me. And Buddhism's pointing us at that. It's not just pointing us at having an experience which is clear, or an experience that is calmed down, or experience that's expansive, or an experience that's exciting or joyful. It's saying actually the way in which you experience things is primary to what it is that you're going to experience. And this is fundamental to these prajna teachings. So this clear seeing or wisdom, perfection of wisdom teachings, is really not about some kind of accumulated understanding. When we hear the word wisdom, a lot of times we think of it that way, as a kind of accumulated understanding. I've lived long enough to realize, like, living a long time is like not what gives you wisdom. You can become less and less wise the longer you live. And you can be more wise the less you live. Now, knowledge is a different thing. You're probably going to know about more stuff the longer you live, just because by the virtue of your experience, right? But time served does not guarantee wisdom. With my apologies to my elders. But that's also true of me. That's true of everyone, right? So it's not about accumulated understanding or knowledge. There's something else. Now, I would say the longer that you practice this something else, the more likely that wisdom is going to be flowing through you. So in that sense, time served really does matter. As long as it's about practicing, as long as it's about wisdom, not just accumulating knowledge. So people who are fixated on accumulating knowledge or understanding usually be kind of overbearing and less effective actually in the way that they're able to present something. But the people who are practicing wisdom, that's different. If you're lucky enough to know your grandmother, she probably was practicing wisdom. Not guaranteed, but probably. If you think about the places where you're like, damn, how did grandma know that? You know? So I'm not saying it's just people who are steeped in prajnaparamita literature or studying Buddhism or something that have this capacity. I was lucky enough to know both my grandmas a little bit, not super well. But my chain-smoking grandma was so badass. She raised 14 kids. Yeah. And canned tomatoes like you wouldn't even believe. And she had absolutely no patience for abstraction. Nothing. It was like, boom. It's like a rock. She's like 4'11", I think. And all of her, she had 9 sons, and they're all like my size. And then 5 daughters, and they're more her size, but a little bit bigger. When my wife, who's very tiny, when she first met my grandmother gave her this huge hug. And my grandmother has she's passed away now, but she had like 65 grandchildren, you know? So this is like Catholic, you know, Irish Catholic, small town, Ohio. It's great. And she gives my wife this big hug, you know, and big kiss, which we're always trying to dodge, but, you know, she would usually get in there. And she said, "Welcome to the family. Finally someone shorter than I am." Anyway, so wisdom. I'm not saying it's this thing that is like the package that you're expecting, right? But it's something quite ineffable, actually. It's something which is ungraspable, and what's at the base of it is ungraspability. The fact that it's ungraspable is what makes it animate a path. And this path of liberation, called the perfections or the crossing overs, is animated by wisdom. So when we study the prajnaparamita teachings, we oftentimes are studying the clear seeing of wisdom, and sometimes that gets very philosophical, or it gets can get kind of heady. But the whole point of that is about how it is that you're seeing the world, how it is that you're enacting that clear seeing as a life. And so this is why you oftentimes see wisdom in people who have just done very important, straightforward work in the world. Because they're compelled by the truth of that work. And being compelled by that straightforward truth of that work, wisdom adheres to their being. Yeah. So, this kind of teaching goes also into the earliest teachings we know from Shakyamuni Buddha, which most people are familiar with. If you were lucky enough to go to school sometime after the 2000s, you probably even learned about it in your middle school textbook. The Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. I was so happy when I taught middle school, and then I never had that. There was nothing about that then in the textbook that they gave me, which I didn't use because textbooks are boring, but I opened it up, and it was like, oh, there's fourfold truth and the Eightfold Path. I was so excited. And the Eightfold Path, which is really the path about liberation from suffering, about transformation from a world in which we regard things as objects, and we're always trapped in this kind of subject-object relationship where satisfaction isn't possible. That's just so clearly evident. Like, just next time you really get what you want, just watch that. Like, when I mean by get what you want, it's something real, like, simple, like an ice cream cone or something. Enjoy the heck out of the ice cream cone. And then when you're done, ask yourself, am I satisfied? And you might say yes. But then, like, wait 2 minutes and ask yourself, am I satisfied? Am I satisfied? Am I satisfied? Unlikely, right? It's unlikely you'll be satisfied. I love ice cream cones. I plan to eat plenty of them this summer. But we have this kind of bad habit of trying to invest in the idea that if I could obtain this object of my desire, that would bring satisfaction. That's the kind of fundamental mistake. So this path that the Buddha gave to us, who said this is a way. It's not just a place to get to. It's a way of being. It's a way of living. It's a way of regarding things that changes that around. And in this classical formulation, he gave 8 folds to that path. Right? There's 8 different aspects to that path, or eight facets. That there's a right view, and there's a right intention, and then there's right speech, there's right action, there's right livelihood, there's a right effort, and there's a right mindfulness and right concentration. So that's the Eightfold Path. We don't practice a lot with the Eightfold Path at this temple. In Mahayana in general, there's not usually diving into the Eightfold Path as much. It's awesome medicine, and if it resonates with you, I encourage you to go for it. Like, really study it. There's lots of good information. Access to Insight has a website which they really, very particularly going into those teachings. The reason I bring them up here is because from the very early teaching there was a division in those eight. The first 2, which is a kind of right understanding and right intention, it gets translated in different ways. That was referred to the facet of the path which is prajna, or wisdom, correct understanding, or clear seeing. And from that clear seeing could flow a true way of speaking. Now, usually this gets translated right, like right speech. Sometimes I like to use the word true. True speech is different than something you could circumscribe as being correct, right? Like, to speak something truthfully, you couldn't say what that is. Like, you couldn't find the edges of it and say what it is. You have to think about something else, right? What is it to speak truthfully? Right? So true speech, right? A true action, a true livelihood. Right? So that's the active side, which is referred to as sila, or sometimes we call ethics. It's like, okay, we've got some clear view. What does that clear view turn into? What is it like when we are living with that clear view? That's these next 3. And then concentration and mindfulness are like, what is the posture of the mind, which is referred to as samadhi. Sometimes people say, what's the concentration, what's the mindfulness? Those are the 2 that are on that fold. But how is my mind? So we can see right from this very early part that we're studying that in Buddhism. To walk the path is to study these things, to study, how do I understand things? How am I seeing things? From what perspective am I seeing things? And what is the truth of that way that I'm seeing things? What am I doing? What am I saying? Right? How am I making life work? Like, right, livelihood, we hear that and we think like, oh, what's my job? Totally good understanding. But it's more than that. It's not just what your job. It's like, what's your life? What's your living? What are you doing? How are you contributing to the world? Are you just bumping along? Just in your boat being like, oh, let me avoid the rocks. See if I can get to the ocean. You will get to the ocean. It's called death, by the way. But that's, you'll get there. But how are you getting there? Right? That's the point. You can just spend your life avoiding the rocks, right? And that's not so bad. That's better than just running into the rocks and having catastrophe and just getting pulled out to the sea. I think it's better, but but really only if you learn to use your boat, now you have an opportunity to do all kinds of things, not just avoid rocks. So, the way of seeing, the mind states, and the way of living or being, the way of working with your boat is completely inseparable. And this is really core Buddhist teachings. Right? So when we're studying the Prajnaparamita teachings, we study some clear seeing. It's not just about clear seeing. It's not just about true seeing. It's about true living. And it's about a true regard. I really like that word regard. What's our regard for things? Oftentimes when we say like concentration or mindfulness, which are also important, or mind postures, we get really in this kind of like mindset that I'm going to learn how to do that. I'm going to break through. I'm going to forge my way of like my mind state in the world. And there's a place for that. But there's also something way simpler, which just ask yourself, how do you regard it? Do you regard the play of children as noisy and annoying? I do sometimes, right? What is it? How do you regard it? And it's easier with things that are beautiful, like flowers. So I encourage that. You see the flower. It's easy to regard the flower as beautiful. But if you look at the flower for a while, then you also have to regard the flower as fragile, as impermanent, right? As a certain kind of incapacity to satisfy my grasping. That doesn't mean it's not beautiful. Actually, that makes me look for a different kind of beauty rather than the one I can hold on to and grasp. So everything's like that. And those aren't like things you muscle yourself into. It's really about a habit of mind and a habit of care for the world and for myself. My teacher was really fond of using the term stepping along the Buddha way. There's a lot of words in Japanese for walk, or at least there's several words for walk. The one that's usually used is aruku, which just means walk. But there's another word, one of my favorite words in Japanese, ayumu. It has kind of a nice sound, ayumu. And ayumu means just, it's like walking, like it's an emphasis of stepping along. And the character itself means like a little stop. A little stop. Like if you think about that, every time you put your foot down, you're putting weight on that foot. It requires something. You're paying attention to a place. You're not just going somewhere. Right? When we walk like that, you can watch all the time we're walking like that. We don't really know where we are. We're just kind of leaned forward, and sort of doing that, or maybe lean back and kind of, and sort of lumbering along. But this ayumu is like, no, actually my foot goes down somewhere. And as it's going, even unbeknownst to me, even when I'm spacing out, there's this whole process going on in my body that is assessing the quality of the ground, the angle, the pitch, everything. And then it's going to receive the weight. And the only way to walk is that foot has to totally receive the weight. It's like a stop, but it's a little stop, right? And as that happens, the other foot can come up, and then movement's possible because the other foot can move because this one has stopped somewhere, right? It's not rigidly stopped, but it's in this totally receptive mode. It's receiving the keeping up. It's receiving the support of the ground. So in that receptivity, the other one the other one can go. So this is exactly what I'm talking about with the Prajnaparamita teachings. You might have some clear seeing, some understanding of emptiness, which we'll get here in a second. And so, yeah, your mind can rest in that. And you say, wow, what are the implications? But while you're saying that, the other foot's coming up, and it's going to go somewhere. And it's going to go somewhere in relationship to where this foot is, and the quality of this foot. So then the action that you're taking, you're going to put, you've got to invest. If you're going to actually take action, you have to invest. You have to commit to it, right? Even if it's just chocolate versus vanilla. Or, you know what I noticed when I had ice cream cone the other day? It wasn't swirled. They call it a swirl, but it's not a swirl. It's a half and half, right? I think if they turned it while they were serving it, it might turn into a swirl. But actually, it's just half chocolate, half vanilla, which is also delicious if you like that kind of thing. So, 6 perfections. Prajna animates a path. Whatever we learn about wisdom, this ineffable thing, which comes from a very straightforward but invested, careful heart, then the way we see starts to open up. And then the way we act, our mind posture, can follow from that. One thing that happens when people practice or when they study Prajna teachings is oftentimes the Prajna teachings become a perspective of emptiness. That was classically called being stuck in the ghost cave.
Stuck where?
Ghost cave. Yeah. So real classical. This has happened to people in the Mahayana school, particularly Zen practitioners, forever. So those who've been practicing for a while, you might have experienced this before, where emptiness becomes a perspective. And when emptiness becomes a perspective, basically it becomes a certain form of nihilism. You can undercut everything with this teaching of emptiness. And so if you get that way a little bit, if you're like, oh well, it's empty, it doesn't matter. If you ever kind of hear that voice in your head, think ghost cave, which is kind of exciting, but actually you don't want to hang out there. Trust me, it's not so great. There's a kind of darkness which is really like the beautiful womb, and there's a kind of darkness which is just like empty despair. And the ghost cave is more like that, and that's where it heads. So if you notice yourself, that the reason for that is because you're emphasizing the perspective as if it's a place. But if you think about, this is kind of philosophical, but if you think about the teaching of emptiness in relation to a place to stand, if you're thinking your place to stand is the perspective of emptiness, you're just like in a hole, right? And being in that hole is where the despair comes from. This is very, very common in our age, and this kind of problem, but we'll get to that later. Prajna is living out awakening, not a perspective. So I want to talk today about three types of this clear seeing of emptiness, or 3 facets, or 3 ways that people discuss it. There's many, many. And then invite you to think about that type of seeing and regard for things and how it might unfold in your life this week, and then next week we'll start talking a little bit about how it relates to these other parts of the perfections. So, like I said, there's many ways to talk about emptiness. Even the word emptiness, lots of times people will say, can't we change the word from emptiness? Because it's so empty. And it's kind of a scary word. And so, yeah, that's great. Sometimes people do. Some people like say, well, it's not empty, it's totally full. Or, which is not, yes, it is. That can be true. But some people like to focus on interdependence, which is really probably the best other word to use in relationship to emptiness. Rather than changing emptiness to a different word, to say that sometimes this Buddha's understanding or wisdom is expressed as emptiness, and sometimes expressed as interdependence. And if you think of those as being different ways to talk about the same thing, That's probably best, rather than trying to change emptiness. Shunyata is the word for emptiness in Sanskrit, and it really means empty. There's different theories about where the origins of the word, but the dominant one is it's kind of like it's like a word for puffed up, like a bubble. So if you think of like a soap bubble, and what's outside the soap bubble and what's inside the soap bubble is just the same space, right? And that's how things are. Things are just like this kind of bubbles arising, and we regard them as solid, but actually they're empty. But not empty as a perspective, like I'm solid and they're empty, right? But that there just really isn't any fundamental stability or truth to those things in a permanent sense. So, lots of ways that people come at that. If you're kind of person who really likes very organized, like this is the first aspect of emptiness, this is the second aspect of emptiness, this is da-da-da-da. There's great teachings, particularly out of the Vajrayana traditions of Tibet. So the Vajrayana traditions in Tibet, particularly the Gelugpa school, is highly philosophical and massively organized. So if you're the kind of person who loves there's 5 aspects of emptiness, and under the first one, there's the A version of the first aspect of this, and da-da-da, which is a wonderful kind of teaching. Go and look, for example, at some of the Dalai Lama's books on the Heart Sutra, for example. Very beautifully put together in that way. If you're the kind of person who prefers a little more Zen way, well, then the way I talk about it will probably, you'll like a little bit more, the Zen teacher. But also, I would say a Thich Nhat Hanh is a really beautiful example of a teacher who teaches in this little bit rounder way. Like there's just a circle and you're like, I think they're talking about something different. And then you get back to the beginning of the circle, you're like, oh, they just said the same thing again. And so that's a Zen teaching. It can get annoying, but it's sort of how it goes. So, so look around if you're interested in these kind of teachings. There's lots and lots of good literature out there about it, on the internet as well. But the 3 that I'd like to talk about today. The first one comes from a story about Ajahn Chah, who was a famous kind of revivalist of the Thai forest tradition, which is a monastic tradition in South Asia, in the Theravadan school. And he was quite a powerful teacher. And many of the Western teachers in insight meditation and those kinds of things studied underneath Ajahn Chah, or one of his disciples. And there's a story that one time Ajahn Chah, he picked up the glass. Usually if someone's giving a talk, there's a glass of water. And he picked up the glass and he said, this glass is wonderful because it is already broken. It's already broken. Or I think maybe technically he said, because I regard it as already broken. So this is one of the teachings of emptiness, that everything is impermanent and is made up of elements that are not itself. Right? The glass is made up of all kinds of things which aren't a glass. Right? And it will break at some point. I've learned this living at the temple for 20 years. With students bowing, good. At some point it will break, yeah. So let's think about that for a second. A lot of times we take that just in a negative way, right? Knowing that the glass will sometimes break, knowing that the boat will at some point arrive at the ocean, knowing that things don't last forever. That's disappointing to us. But there's actually a really deep significance to it. When we think only in straight lines that go on forever, we're like hungry ghosts. We're never satisfied. But the wholeness of a life, whether it's the life of a glass or your life, can only be revealed by the circle that your life is. Birth and death. And we know that intuitively. Among the pain of losing something or someone that we really care for, we can really feel the wholeness of their life. We can know the wholeness of their life. And that's the only way. You know what happens when the line goes on forever? You become a vampire. Right? Or a zombie. You know, I'm kind of joking about that, but it's true. That perspective is like, what blood will I drink? Right? What essence of others will I steal to try to keep the line straight and perpetual? That's our regard for life when we try to cling to it in that way, whether it's the life of something that we care about, or someone we care about, or ourselves. Right? So for Ajahn Chah to be able to say, what is wonderful about this is that it's already broken, is not a negative statement. It's a statement about wholeness, which is kind of counterintuitive, because usually we think brokenness is the like antithesis of wholeness. But it turns out it's not the case. Right? Actually breaking is what reveals the wholeness. So this is one aspect of emptiness. It tends to focus on non-attachment. Right? It tends that way. Notice non-attachment does not mean going cold too. This is really important. Non-attachment means the thing I love, I should hold like this, not like that. Right? The thing I love, I should hold like this. That whenever I say that, that old Sting song comes through my head. If you love someone, set them free. Remember that song? And he just goes, set them free, 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 set them free, and goes on and on and on and on. But that's how it is. Free is not like get away from me. Free is like, I love you. Will you stay here with me for the time that you can? So, another aspect, and I talked about this earlier, that kind of flows from this is interdependence. So if we go back to the glass, we think about the glass and we focus on where does the glass come from? What has to participate in there being this glass? And this is a beautiful teaching of like the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, where he follows out. Have people read this, any of his works before? I know some of you have. You know, he has, my favorite line is when he says, if you were a poet, he doesn't say if you were a Zen master, or if you were awakened, or he says if you were a poet, which if you're a poet, you can take the bonus points on this one. If you're a poet, you would see that this paper contains the sun and the rain and the earth. And then he goes out and he lists all of the things which allow a piece of paper to come into existence, which is much more romantic than the furnace and the silicon beads that turned into this. And it probably was like a steel form that crushed it together. You know, so you could think it out. It's not quite as romantic. The paper's nice. There's trees and birds and all that sort of. And if you followed it out far enough, you would find those in the silicon beads and the iron thing and everything with the glass too. The water. We could talk about the water. Probably the Mackenzie. This water's probably from Mackenzie. So just think about that. Clear Lake. You ever been to Clear Lake? It's right here. Now it's me. Clear Lake is Ejo. So that's another way we focus on it. One is the kind of whatever you run into, it's not linear, it's actually a circle, which you can appreciate. And if you appreciate that circle, you can see that there's all manner of beings which are not that circle that are participating in the appearance of that circle that you're meeting. And whether that's a flower or a glass or another person or a situation. Both of these are really wonderful, but they both can lead to the observer becoming too strong. Like when you appreciate that things are already broken and that they're interdependent, it's good to look that way. Look at things and see that that's true. But as you're doing that, what will happen is your observing self will become a little stronger. Like I'm the one that's observing that the flower is impermanent. And again, it's okay. But another facet of emptiness is, this is really emphasized in the Prajnaparamita Sutras, There's no place to stand. There's no place from which to look at the flower and judge it as impermanent. That you were completely involved in the impermanence of the flower. Your mind and the flower and the circle of that all is not separate from your own being. And this is where you start to get into the a more Zen teaching, more Mahayana, very kind of slippery. I believe what the Buddha said, but have no idea what they said. Or, okay, Ejo, yeah, that sounds so true to me, but what does it mean? I have a question of myself. Then that's actually where you start slipping into when you take this regard. When you look at the flower, you're not just looking for, I can locate impermanence there, but you realize your own seeing is also impermanence. Your own impermanence is what allows you to see. The clear seeing of Avalokiteshvara is not Avalokiteshvara as this kind of like pillar of stone that is then looking upon the world that is changing, but the pillar doesn't change. Avalokiteshvara's clear seeing is no place to stand, is a continual emergence. In the case of Avalokiteshvara, that's the bodhisattva of compassion, is a continual response to the heartache of being. That's what Avalokiteshvara is. There's no pillar. There's no place from which to see. There is only the freedom to see. In fact, the name Avalokiteshvara, Ishvara, is an interesting term. Not many bodhisattvas or gods from South Asia have that title, but Avalokiteshvara does. Ishvara means like the sovereign of clear seeing. But the sovereign here also means like the freedom. Usually we think of sovereign like the king, right? The king's like in charge of everything. They're the controller. But this is a little different. Avalokiteshvara is not the controller. Avalokiteshvara is the center of the whole country. That's a classical way to understand what the king was. The king was the country. For better or for worse. Not advocating monarchy. But the king was like the mandala of the whole kingdom, rested on the divine mandate of that central pillar to the kingdom. That's how humans were organizing themselves. That's the only way they knew how. I think it's good that we got over that. But mostly, I hope. But Avalokiteshvara here is a sovereign, is a totally free being of seeing that is only located in the land of seeing clearly. That's what Avalokiteshvara is. And so the no place to stand, that's also my practice. Not that I'm here and I'm looking at the flower and judging its impermanence, but that the flower is an invitation to me recognizing my own impermanence, and that impermanence is participating in relationship to the flower or the glass or the person. And meditation helps us wake up to this. Okay, so these are three kind of versions of emptiness. So if you're taking the teaching I'm giving today into your life, I would say just take those three versions. Circle, not a straight line, right? Requires you to hold it like this, not like that. The second one is look at how whatever it is that you're regarding is connected to everything. You can just follow it out. And then include yourself. Don't just put it over there. And if you put those at the basis of the way that you're thinking about things, then try to meet things in that way. Joyous things, difficult things, neutral things. Just try to meet them that way. And then next week, we'll take those principles and then start applying them a little bit to what does it mean to live. But it'd be good to just explore right there at that level a bit. Anyone has any questions?
Just on. I was thinking, like, why are we so in love with vampires and zombies, and pop culturally, and it feels like it's so hard for us to imagine that things end, and all of our digital ways, we have content that is basically immortal because if you lose it, you can just download it onto your new smartphone.
Yeah.
But we know that that's not good.
Yeah.
We don't want the spores to invade us.
Yeah.
You know.
I just read an interesting article a couple weeks ago. It was titled "Why the Internet Sucks," and it was really good. And he was analyzing a point in time when the internet that we knew really changed. And his thesis, or his kind of point, was when memory got really cheap.
Memory got really what?
Really cheap. So it used to be you didn't try to save everything. You couldn't. But when memory got really cheap, and I'm using those words, I'm not sure those are the words he's using. I'm using those words on purpose. When memory gets cheap, memory is cheap. I mean, in all facets of the word. And when memory is cheap, then you're a hungry ghost. Memory should be the thing that feeds your soul, right? And now it's like, oh, don't want to lose that. Oh, throw it in the Apple cloud, whatever thing. My phone keeps telling me, you're going to lose your pictures if you don't pay money. And I'm like, ah! And then I think, my wife does that. I'm off the hook. Right? And it is. We should have photos. It's wonderful that we have memories and we have ways of creating memories, but we've come in this relationship with it, which is really cheapening. And because we cheapen it, we don't really relish it. And if you think about the way that a really beautiful memory does not stay static. A beautiful memory lives through you. In fact, the people who study how your brain works tell us your brain does not work anything like a hard drive. Like, that's the idiom that we live in. We think that, like, oh, I'm like a computer. You're nothing like a computer. And the way that your brain remembers things, do you know this? It recreates it every time. Every time you remember something, you literally recreate it in the neural network of your mind. At least this is what the people who think they know what they're talking about say is happening right now, which sounds pretty good to me. It's very interdependent. And so the beauty of this is that a memory is really alive. It's not something you put in a file cabinet and that you go out and you look at it every once in a while. And that, sometimes people, you see the problems with that, like if you're confirmation bias kind of stuff, you change the information to suit, your desires. So there's a way, especially if you're trying to do scientific work, that you need to protect against that. But for, I think, the more important work of memory is something else. And it points to this circle that I'm talking about. The point of the memory is to reveal the circle. The point of the memory is to reveal that things are not, they're not meant to be living forever. What lives forever is totally beyond that kind of thinking. It's the I itself.
Mm-hmm. As you know, I had this episode back in the fall, in which I could not lay down any memory in the present moment, which led to a lot of inquiry and contemplation and out of all that, and I may have already probably told you this, but it's very difficult. There is no memory then. And with no memory, there is no present. And that seems so huge to me. And then I also realized that the way that it gets stored, memories are stored through the recreating, in telling, remembering, writing, and I don't know, this was some kind of, everything was a little different afterwards.
And because of your long-term concern or regard for the way, you could take that kind of experience and realize that it says something about everyday life, about all the memories that you are now making, because, luckily, that didn't last forever. Right, and it's not supposed to last forever. It's also a circle.
Right.
It's a kind of circle you can never see into in the way that you can other kind of memories.
Right.
I think that's a place where often as people get confused in Buddhism, they think if I became totally clear or totally concentrated, that all consciousness would go quiet and that there would be no memory. Now that's actually true. There are concentration states in which that's true. But the purpose of those concentration states is not to keep yourself locked in a place in which there is no memory. those concentration states are very beneficial because they help to they help you relinquish the fixation on circles of experience. So that kind of release that comes from that is a worthy thing to work for in like a retreat practice and those kinds of things, deep concentration, but not for the reason we think. Oftentimes we think that's how I want to be, but no, you don't want to be like that. Actually, you want to be able to have these circles that are flowering and flowering and flowering and flowering. You know. That, by the way, for those of you who are turned on by the Lotus Sutra, that's what the Lotus Sutra is about. The Lotus Sutra is flower after flower after flower after flower after flower. It's a circle. It's a story of wholeness, which gets told over and over and over and over again in different scales and sizes, which is what the Buddha Dharma is inviting us into. Not this kind of like stark landscape of like ghost cave disappointment.
I was struck, especially when you were talking about seeing the glass is already broken. I immediately went to thinking about, what's closest, like thinking about my children that way.
Yeah.
And it sounds so dark and so stark, but really like, what are the implications for how we meet each other if that's how we're meeting each other? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know well through loss what it is to really know appreciation. And could we live that way before we lose somebody? Like, that's the question. I don't think there's any trick to it. There's no magic formula there. It's actually a discipline of regard. When I meet someone, when I'm treasuring someone, like our children, could I treasure them like that? Then that is a discipline, but it's not a discipline of a kind of like tight rigor. It's a discipline of how it is that we return and again to it, because I have all my own karma, which is I'm trying to reduce things into certain forms because of all of my own experiences. So how do I just regard that in a way that brings it, I'm not just looking at the flower from over here, right? I'm involved in how I'm looking at the flower, and that gives us another kind of chance. And like because you raised a couple kids, is that's not all like the kind of flowers that smell good. That's like the gnarly biz, man. It's like how do you really bring that regard to the place where there can be tears and sweat and difficulty, as well as that kind of the wholeness is all of those things. So just thinking, in a way, in like when a flower is blooming, don't you love when it's budding? Isn't that just kind of so great? But that wouldn't be great if it didn't open up, And then when it opens up, it always feels to me a little bit like, okay, now it's time. And then it's like time stops. I once heard of a Native American tribe in which they count people's age until, I believe it was maybe either 13 or 17, I think. And they had a prescribed things that needed to be done as you were coming to age. And once you had gone around that circle once, then they no longer counted age. It was like, well, you've bloomed. And the kind of way that people could live with that mind, that I have come full circle, and now it's a good day. That's all I have to know, and it doesn't have to be longer or shorter or anything else. I'm hoping to stick around for a while, but Someone over here was kind of at the same time.
So you talked about the ghost cave.
Yeah.
And that resonated with me a lot.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a word for what happened to me.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you may speak to a little bit of, you go up to the ghost cave, how do you get out of the ghost cave?
Yeah. It traditionally is considered very difficult. So I don't say that to dissuade you or discourage you, but to say that if it's taking a lot, that's one of the reasons it's something that's warned against, right from the beginning. So it takes a lot of work. Not just kind of grinding work, but the kind of like constant returning to something. So one of the interesting things, it depends on the different quality for people, how that might manifest. But one of the really classical responses is walking barefoot. So I take that in a literal sense and also in a metaphorical sense. Right? What the ghost cave kind of situation perspective that happens is a profound isolation. And the profound isolation is buttressed by a kind of undercutting of all things, in mental habits which are undercutting all things. When you walk barefoot, it's hard to do. And there's an energetic thing which happens in which you ground in a way, and you can't. The ghost cave's up here, right? So it's doing this energetic thing of grounding you, but it's also the challenge of walking without protection on your feet requires a certain kind of paying attention to things. Yeah. And if you first do I'll tell you a trick about that. I really love barefootness, although I make people wear shoes when they're at the temple because people track stuff in. But you just go for a walk. Barefoot's great. But when you step on, what happens is when you get to a place where it's a little challenging, when you're stepping on something, it's a little bit sharp, your foot will stiffen. And with the stiffening of your foot, energy will go up. But what the discipline in that is, as you step on the thing that's a little bit sharp, soften your foot. And each time you step on that, you can practice that. As you're stepping on it, and your reaction will be kind of tightening and the whole body tightening and the energy pumping up. Just practice like, oh no, put my foot down. Like I was saying before, ayumu, put your foot down, let it soften, and then let it take your weight. Now if it's really like crushed glass or something, you can do crushed glass oftentimes. I have learned. If it's pointed the wrong direction, you're in trouble. But that kind of, just softening and just see what's there. And if it's too much, then pick your foot up and put it somewhere else. That's fine. But you're in that kind of relation with it. And that, again, in a like real literal sense, and then in a metaphorical sense, are I think like really the core medicine. And one thing that's cool about that medicine is, this is real. And not theoretical. It's just right. It's like there. Feel it and know it. And we have a lot of interesting things to step on in Oregon. Banana slugs. That's always a little funky. Dog poo, which hopefully you realize before you fully put your toes in it. But if you haven't, you're barefoot and you can wash it off. It's easier to wash off than your shoes, actually, when you step in that. But more than that is things like where's the ground wet, where it's soft, where, in what part of the year is it? Like in the summer now, everything right now will be kind of, like some places dry, and then you walk other places, you'll be like, oh, this is where the water's moving. Because it will be kind of wet. The grass will be a little green. There'll be, like that kind of thing. And then later in the summer, it will all start getting a little bit hard. And the places are really hard and sticky, and other places that still have a little moisture. So you get to learn about all those, all that kind of qualities of the earth. Okay, we should finish up for questions. And then before we do the closing chant today, we have had the profound good fortune to have Kosen as a resident since the beginning of this year. And she is leaving residency or has just left residency, but not too far. Just how many minutes by walk or bike ride? 9-minute bike ride over at the Maitreya village that's over here. And so she's not disappearing from our midst, but has been a wonderful resident and so supportive of community, both in the way that she's served here, but also, Kosen, just in your presence, the way that you are. You have a way of uplifting others and the whole community. And I can speak on behalf of the Sangha to thank you for bringing that spirit here as a resident and continuing when you can to be here in this Sangha. So.
Thank you, Ojo-san. To the Sangha, and for this container, where I felt deeply held these past 6 months. And for trusting me the day that I came in and allowing me to move in so quickly.
Yeah. That was a trip.
Yeah.
Usually when someone comes and says, I want to be a resident, I say, well, okay, maybe next year. Hopefully it was quick.
The deep, deep trust, and for having practiced alongside you. And, yeah, the beauty of being in Sangha, being here, being present, your level of presence.
Till then.
Yeah. Feeling filled with gratitude and joy, and I admire the level of openness that is constantly flowing through these walls, and how difficult it is to come here and to be met, but then to continue to devote yourself to attempting to be met. Yeah. Thank you.